Welcome to the Fifth Trooper Podcast.
Hello and welcome to the Fifth Trooper Podcast. My name is Jay Shalansky and my co-host is Evan Bulris.
Hey, how's it going?
Well, Evan, it's going amazing. So we are on Season 2, Episode 3, which is super exciting. How you
New
feel?
year, new me. Hey,
Yeah.
that's awesome. We've gotten to talk to, it's funny because all these, a lot of these folks we're talking to are either people I've met along the road or, I see at these conventions. So it's cool that I actually get to connect with them in like I guess a more professional form.
Yeah.
Right? 'Cause before it was just me like, hey man, I really like your game and I see you at every show, so we might as well become like at least acquaintance friends, right? Like,
Yeah.
now it's actually like, hey, do you want to talk to us in a, do you want to like,
Semi-professional
yeah,
setting,
right? Like, it went from like, hey man, do you want an energy drink I have extra to like, tell me about, bolt action, right? So it's pretty
Right.
cool.
Yeah, and so we're just going to do a little talking about what's going on with us and the network, and then we actually have a couple of guys, Brian and Aaron from Anvil Games coming on, and really excited to talk to them and what they've got going on. And so, we're still going down our path here, which has been amazing, and I mean, quite honestly, has rejuvenated me just hearing and talking to new people and about like their experiences with gaming and stuff. And it's just been incredible so far.
It's just fun, man. Like I still love Legion. I still have all my stuff,
Yeah.
but I've gotten in the town I started playing in. It was Warhammer or nothing. So I bought into Warhammer, and Ninth is around the corner. Ninth is coming out like shortly, right? That
Yeah.
was just announced. So I'm actually maybe looking back into that, like playing that in somewhat of a competitive form. But I liked it, but I'm like, man, I really wish there were other games. And then I started going to these conventions. I'm seeing oh, what's Dust Tactics? What's
Right.
Bolt Action? I didn't realize these all existed. And then turns out there's actually big communities out there. They're just not here. They're just like not in Syracuse. So it's cool that I'm actually getting to talk to these guys and just to kind of exposing you to the games I wish I'd known about before, like I bought in heavy to Warhammer. I mean, Legion turned out cool because I like Star Wars, right?
Yeah.
Like that
Yeah.
kind of that worked out pretty good. But like, let's say Legion didn't come out, like there's like just the stuff we've been.
Yeah.
I mean, heck, even Cruel Seas, like
Right.
from Warlords, like this boat game, like that sounds cool, man. Like Oak and Iron, like it's
Yeah.
all really cool stuff.
And so it's interesting because I feel like this is an extension of what we've been doing this whole time, which is just talking to interesting people about interesting things. Just before it was more in the bubble of Legion, and now we're kind of expanding a little bit. But to that end, if for those of you who haven't seen it, if you're still listening to us, hoping that we'll talk about Legion again someday, which we may. Scoundrels actually released a new episode this week. They are in their first episode of season 2, and what they're doing is they're going to kind of fill some of the gaps that we're leaving behind. So if you hadn't listened to Scoundrels before because they were too high competitive for you, Zach Barry, who's actually Thrawn from the Discord, has joined up with them as their fourth, and they're going to start doing more middle of the road kind of conversations about Legion with a little bit of competitive spiced in there here and there, but they're really going to try to talk more about hobbying and building fun lists and all that sort of stuff. So I highly recommend checking them out. For those of you that are Patreon members and you subscribe because you wanted Legion, well, let me tell you, we got some amazing Patreon rewards coming up in the month of June for Legion that will have special Surge tokens.
Yeah, no joke. Those are pretty dope.
And special victory counter tokens. This one I'll spoil. It's actually going to be the Scoundrels' new logo icon. So they got a new logo, they got a new look, and we're going to be giving victory tokens out for Legion and Surge tokens, which I'm really excited about. For those of you that have been ordering with us, the Legion order tokens that have been on back order, they should be in the next couple days. We'll get those packed up and out to you. And then I also wanted to let you know that we're going to be doing X-Wing mats. We got 4 new X-Wing designs that will be launching this week for pre-order. We're also going to be doing water-based mats 3x3 for like oak and iron, cruel seas, or what's the plain one there, Evan?
Oh, Blood Red Skies.
Blood red skies,
Yeah,
or
you're fighting over
maybe
the Pacific or something, right?
yeah, or you could get them for Legion for a skirmish game where and you build up like a Genosis or something.
Oh, yeah,
Um,
that's actually really cool. I didn't think of that. Yeah.
right, and put terrain on top of it. So there's a lot of options. Those will be up this week sometime for pre-orders. So check those out. I'm trying to think. There was something else I wanted to talk about, but I can't think of it right now. Evan, what do you got? Anything you
Uh,
want to talk about?
no, man, it's I'm just happy to, be branching out a little bit. I've had it in my head to do a couple video reviews coming up. I didn't realize how much
Oh
work they
yeah,
would be causing me, and so the problem is like I've rewrote and re-talked over content like 5 or 6 times now, and it's like because it's I want it to be the way I want it to be. I know it sounds weird when I say it like that,
yeah,
but like listening to myself, I'm like, oh, this guy sounds like a bore. And then I do too high energy, and I'm like, oh, now I'm just screaming at people. So it'll be out somewhat soon. I'm hoping within this week. Probably this weekend I'll get more time to finish it off. But
yeah.
no, honestly, cheers off to anybody who does video reviews of stuff, because the amount of work it takes to get it just the way they like it.
Oof. Yeah,
Right? Like take like a look at like the Internet Historian. Like his videos are
yeah.
they're, even though they're just comedy and like different things he talks about, like it looks so simple, but the amount of work that is actually pretty astronomical to get it that perfect for how he does stuff. So I really
Yeah,
have
I
I've
mean,
grown an appreciation for that kind of thing.
well, that was like that Fifth Trooper spoiled. We did one video so far, but I really want to bring that back for some of these other games that we're talking about, and in the future, if we get a hold of other games early. But I mean, look at we put a ton of production into that. I built you a whole hand puppet stage, right? Like,
Yeah.
so there's, yeah, I get it, man. But we just wanted you to know that, for the listener, we're bringing you all kinds of different content. But if you're still just want Legion, Scoundrels is still there. They're going to be moving more towards the middle. Our YouTube channel still going to be having some great Legion content on it, and our blog, of course, will always have Legion, right? So
Hmm.
just check that stuff out. But hopefully maybe you could join us for this little journey that we're going on, and we're excited to have you. And don't fear, we're still making mats and tokens and all kinds of Legion accessories. We'll still be doing that. Plus, now that we're getting into new games, we'll start making accessories for those as well. But yeah, so without further ado, let's go talk to Brian and Aaron. All right, and we are here with Aaron and Brian from Anvil 8 Games. How's it going, guys?
Pretty
Really
good.
well, thank you.
So why don't we start with we'll start with Brian. If you want to kind of tell us what you do over at Anvil 8 Games, what's your title? What's your favorite color?
Oh
Any
yeah,
of that?
yeah, yeah. I'm Brian from Anvil Games. I'm a Sagittarius. I yeah, and blue is my favorite color. No, I am the director of Anvil Games, which kind of means in our kind of small company way that I get the pleasure of wearing every hat at some point or another.
Yep.
Some days I'm the guy running to the post office, and some days I'm the guy that gets to talk to artists, and do that stuff, and sculptors, and that kind of carry on, and yeah, and all the day to day stuff with the conventions, and so yeah, that's me.
All right, Aaron, how about you?
Well, my favorite color is orange because I'm not
Ooh.
totally cliche like Brian.
Also, probably not a Sagittarius.
No, I'm a Capricorn. Yeah, I am a game designer at Anvil 8, and I work with Brian all the time and bother him about every single question I have. So he is basically on speed dial for me. But yeah, I just work on creating new games, playtesting, editing games, and sometimes doing random assorted other things like uploading things to Drive Through RPG.
Nice. So, for those of you out there in the world who aren't familiar with Anvil 8 Games, you guys really have right now 3 games out there: Aetherium, Ethereum, the role playing game, and then Frontline, No Comrades. And so I think today we'd like to talk probably about Ethereum and then the role playing game as well, and just kind of cross into those two. But like what I wanted to start with before we even know about the game, how did you guys start with Ethereum? Like, what was kind of the spark for the flame?
Yeah, so that was me. I used to be an English teacher before I was doing this full time, and I was not to try and like favorably compare myself to J.R.R. Tolkien or anything like that, but I was teaching a class on dystopian literature, and I was sitting in an exam actually, and bored out of my skull, like genuinely, and part of one of the classes, one of the books that I was teaching was William Gibson's Neuromancer, and I've been a hobbyist for a long time, and I just started thinking about what it would take to build a game based in a cyber reality, and started kind of slowly but surely kind of drawing out the factions. What's interesting is that actually the fourth faction that fourth faction that we released was the first one that I wrote for the game.
Oh,
Oh,
cool.
whoa.
For the world. So I'd kind of written out in the kind of periphery of the world, and then as we were making the game, realized that we had to draw it back in and kind of establish the core first before we could get to the frontier, if you know what I mean. Yeah, so that was what started. I'm still a huge fan of William Gibson. I love his work. So
That's awesome. So when you started to think about this, was it something that you were like, okay, this is what I want to do. I know some people that maybe could help me with this, or did you have to kind of blindly trek into this world?
I did know a couple people. So I Adepticon, the convention here near Chicago. It's in Schaumburg now. I've been helping out there with some of their events, and that kind of grew into me kind of creating new events, and that kind of then blossomed into me working kind of freelance, doing some editorial work for a local game company here in Chicago. So I kind of made that kind of trajectory into the gaming world or the gaming industry through the convention. But kind of had it in the back of my head really the whole time that, maybe this is something that I could do. Maybe this is something that would happen. But, even with that, it was still very much a case of me blindly fumbling through all kinds of things. I can't pretend like it's ever gone smoothly. It's always been an adventure, which is part of what it's all about. I feel like I learn something new all the time on this job.
Yeah, I think the gaming industry kind of allows for that too, where it always seems like there's somebody that knows a secret about how to develop or get it out, and then but they're very willing to kind of share it with you, and they're like, okay, well, this was my secret, and this is how I got my game out. It may work for you, but it may not. Um, Go ahead.
Absolutely. Aaron is that guy for me in a lot of ways, actually. So I met Aaron also at conventions, but I won't speak for you, Aaron. So I'll maybe let you do.
It's totally cool if you speak for me. I don't mind.
Okay, so what Aaron was about to say was that, no, sorry.
I was actually thinking it could be amusing if we just introduced each other. Just like, what would Brian say about me? But no, yeah, I have been going to conventions because I've been professionally designing games for almost 7 years now. And I joined up with Anvil 8, 2 years ago? I don't know. Time is totally warped with COVID.
Oh,
So
sure.
I think 2 years ago, but
It's
I don't know
roughly
how
like
much time has passed recently. So
2 to 2.5. We're somewhere in that window.
okay, yeah. So yeah, and I basically just met them at conventions, and I really liked what Ethereum was doing. I liked the ways it was different. And I admittedly have some of those tendencies to want to do things differently because I want to be different. And so there was an initial attraction there. And I liked the way it all came together with the world and everything like that. So met up with them, and then after some amount of time, I changed sort of my job to go over to Anvil 8, and I've been with them and sort of happily plugging away at games ever since.
Yeah, so that's interesting. Brian, how for you was it kind of choosing talent or, deciding someone like Aaron would be a good fit for your vision, right? Because from what I'm understanding and hearing is that you had this vision, you kind of had this thought, you started writing out the factions and the world building and all this stuff. But then to have someone external kind of come on and start writing or building or doing artwork even, right, for the game. How was that for you kind of transitioning to that?
Yeah, that was a process as well. Starting with the artwork. So that's kind of I initially kind of pulled some of the team together from like the Adepticon crowd from the local Chicago crowd, and that's how we started. When I started talking to artists, that was a really interesting thing. There one artist in particular, David Auden Nash, who has done a lot of the work that you've seen in Ethereum. Um, I would write him these like tomes, these emails that just went on for ages about what the world was and like, what things should look like and what was possible and what was not possible. And so for like the first year, he was painting stuff for us. He was doing, I was sending him that kind of stuff. And then, by the last most recent stuff he's done for like the wardens and things like that, I just say like, okay, there's a monk and he is in robes and kind of looks pissed, and Dave's like, yeah, got it, okay, and then he sends back masterpieces, so that's been really interesting. As far as connecting with Aaron, it's interesting. I guess it's been over 5 years now. I guess 8 years total almost since when I first started writing for this stuff. Um, I think increasingly I've learned that I just want to work with people that are good people. We tried early on to work with some people that we weren't really sure, but seemed to have kind of good credentials or whatever, and it's just never worked out. I think for the amount of time that we spend, Aaron was joking about being on speed dial. It's totally not a joke. You have to really enjoy the person's company. You have to like and respect them and have that kind of thing going. And that's definitely my esteem for Aaron was that he came obviously with chops. He came with the credentials. I know a number of the games that he's made and written for, and so I knew that he was capable in that sense. But just the kind of other part of it, I suppose, was the kind of intangible part, was that knowing that or feeling that I could that we could work together very well.
Yeah.
Yeah, it matters a lot. You're actually, I don't think that people always fully appreciate the ways that like you can sort of feel under siege when you're making games, because a lot of people will not like your stuff. I mean, just by default, there's always going to be people who like it and people who don't. And some of those people really let you know.
Yeah.
They'll let you know in person. They'll let you know online. They'll let you know however they want. And then, there's always like gaming is not a lucrative. There's a lot of money in gaming, but that is not going to any particular person for the most part. And so, you really, there's definitely a camaraderie you want, after you've worked like 12 hours at a convention, to be able to relax and be able to say whatever you want with somebody.
Yeah, it's funny. We've talked about this on the podcast before. So a number of years ago, I tried to kickstart a board game myself, and I had done the playtest group at Gen Con for like the whole weekend. I literally didn't see Gen Con. I was just in that playtest.
Is that the first exposure playtest hall or whatever?
Yeah. It's not even a hall; it's a room. And
right.
they lock you in and they just feed people in, and they come sit at your table, you teach them the game, they play the game, and then it's like just like salt on open wounds because they're just writing truthfully about your game. And at that time I had done everything myself, and I was so invested in the game that was just like salt on the wound, okay, salt. But to your point, like the nice thing was we were all kind of in that same position. So like afterwards I would go get drinks with some of the other guys that maybe had already had a game launch, or, you know, we're doing some successful stuff, or like even the guys from like Panda Games or somebody like that, you know, and they would just be like, no, it's cool, man, this happens. And I find that kind of and I think in any industry, right, like that kind of like camaraderie brings you closer, you know.
Oh, definitely. And I, yeah. And, you know, like Aaron wasn't joking. I mean, we work 12 hours a day at these shows between setup and restocking and whatever else. And, you know, at first Aaron was working for a different company, but I was still, you know, like you cross the aisle or whatever, and would still stop by and chat for a bit and just say like, hey, you want to grab a, you know, bite afterwards? And to be able to do that, I think it does take something particular. Yeah, for sure.
Yeah.
It's an
So-
endurance contest as much as anything at those conventions. They really are.
Yeah,
intense.
yeah, and then you kind of look at everyone else and you're like, oh, you survived this too. You're like me.
Yeah.
Like let's go talk and share war stories.
A number of years ago, I ran the Marine Corps Marathon, and there are days after a convention I feel like that.
Yeah.
Yeah, dude, for real.
And that's the other thing that you kind of touched on too about game design in general is that you have to have thick skin.
Yeah.
To like you said, to pour your heart into something, or have an idea that you think is absolutely brilliant, and then just get it stepped on unceremoniously. It's like, oh, you have to be able to take that. And go
Well,
stride.
and it's funny because it's by everyone, right? And they're not even doing it on purpose. They're kind of trying to help build you. But like, I remember, you know, like I did all the artwork and everything for it. And then I talked to like this guy who was doing graphic design, and he's like, yeah, that's never going to sell because of X, Y, and Z. And then I talked to like the manufacturer who I was going to have manufacture it, and they had me talk to their art department. And then they were like, well, I mean, if this is what you want to do, you know, and then you know, and then you would have other developers. But I think it makes you grow. And I think sometimes, and I think you guys probably have this too. And this, a lot of this comes from like, you know, I grew up and I did studio art. I have a degree in studio art. And so like you sit around and you do a painting and you hang it up on the wall and everybody critiques it, right? And says, oh, and I'm sure this happens in writing too, where you write something, you either read it out loud or other people write it and they come back and give you criticism for the most part. And so how do you know, I guess I'll ask Aaron first, how do you know as a game developer when that criticism is real or when it's kind of like art and it's subjective, right? Because you could look at a painting and I could look at a painting and you could say, I hate that. And I could say, I love it, because art is subjective. So at what point from a developer standpoint do you say, no, this is a fatal flaw or this is a subjective trait of the game?
I feel like I need to just preface what I'm about to say by saying
I'm listening.
that
Aaron.
I majored in philosophy and I'm an existentialist, so I don't believe in objective truth anyway. So the easy answer is that you never know, you're always guessing.
Mhm.
And I'll extrapolate on that and basically say that there is a measure where, you know, like Brian said, you have to have thick skin. And I think it's important to have thick skin in the right places, because you can't have skin sort of like this exterior layer where you don't hear the feedback. You actually need to hear it and believe it enough that you can hear what's sort of ringing true in it. And I think that from my perspective, there are essentially two components to knowing whether you should listen to someone on any given subject. One is experience based, and that doesn't mean like, well, I have 7 years of doing this, so I had take priority over someone else. But no, I mean, if you have played more war games than me, and we're working on a war game, you have a lot of experience. Or if you've played that specific character more than me, you have more experience. And so there is an element of experience and just being able to sort of get a natural feel for whether that feels true or accurate. So I think that's part of it. And then I think the other part of it is I'm going to say like sort of your ability to read people, but I mean that in a broad sense, because the reality is not everybody's going to want your game. You can make a hugely successful game like Cards Against Humanity, and there are a lot of people who hate that game.
Yep.
And so you have to basically then say, all right, does this ring true to me? And if yes, then your follow-up question is, but do I care? And you say that like, is this
Right.
actually my market? Because,
Right.
I recently play tested one of the games we're working on with people who'd never played a game like that before. And so I cared about all of their feedback. And there were some of their feedback I categorized under, well, this is a new experience for them. And so this is helpful to see how people who've never experienced this before will take it. How can I tailor it to make it better for people who are new to this type of game? And then there was part of it that was like, oh, that's a complaint because they're not likely to play this sort of game.
Right.
That's not a complaint that, if I grab somebody else who did that, sort of game regularly would have. And so there's just I think it's those two things. That's a very long-winded way to answer that question.
No, I like it. So along the lines of audience, so I think when you're developing a game like this or any game in general, I think for the most part who your audience is, right? While you're developing and designing. But isn't there's a part of you that also wants to reach a new audience or try to expand to an audience. So when you're developing and starting to go through that like early design process or tweaks to an already established game, how does that factor into your decision process?
Yeah, it's a very interesting question. So I am going to be very, very anonymous here about something that somebody that works in the industry once told me. They were working on an update to a game, and some of the players did not like that update, and they basically replied and said to me, they did not say this to them, but they said, um, "Well, that's great, and if they bought more, I would keep tailoring it to them, but they don't, and I
Right.
need people to buy the game." And it's really interesting that that sort of aspect of it, where you're going after a specific market segment, and essentially when you want to adjust for them, and which elements are you going to adjust? Like, are we taking players from one type of game? Are we taking players from another type of game? Where are we appealing more? Are we a skirmish game? Are we? Yeah, I don't know. There's a lot that
No.
goes into it.
So, Brian, for you, you're heading to these cons and the trade shows and stuff. If you're in the booth, I'm expecting that you're going to passionately explain the game to me, right? Because it's your baby, right? You created this from, parts of it, right? And so when you passionately explain it to someone and they're like, "Nah, I'm good," and they just leave, how does that process for you?
Yeah. Uh, I mean, I think at first I was a little bit more like, oh, um, but now I think I just like, I'm almost like, oh, really? Cool. All right. What are you playing?
Mhm.
And like try and get some information about new games that are out there that I might be missing out on or something, because especially, like something like Gen Con, if I walk like 2 aisles over nowadays, I've like really strayed far from the booth. Like I literally don't leave the booth for anything. So I don't get to see a lot of what's out there and stuff like that. So nowadays, when someone comes up and says like, "Yeah, no, I don't want to have to do that. Like, I don't want to have to roll dice."
Right.
That was one of the things that when we went to Essen last year, that
Yeah.
someone saying, "Oh, the dice. Like, why is it randomized?" And you're like, I don't have an answer for that question. Like, if like if you draw a deck of cards, it's just as random in some ways. Like. So yeah, I don't take it personally anymore. And I think maybe at first I was definitely like, ooh, yeah, I wish more people were like immediately like, yes, this is brilliant. But we also knew, I think early on as well with Aetherium, is that we were in between genres a little bit. Like, we had a bit of the board game elements, we have a bit of miniatures game elements. So we knew that we were kind of drawing from different sources in the demographic. So I never really expected all board gamers or all miniatures gamers to be like, yeah, this is for us. But knew that we were going to be taking, appealing to segments of each.
Mm.
And I think, I don't know, in a weird way, it's become a lot more common now, that combination. But I feel like at the time there wasn't a whole lot of that going on.
Yeah, so I guess, well, with that, why don't you kind of explain to us as well as you can in a time afforded to us, Ethereum, and maybe, I guess start from the beginning where you started when you were sitting in that test and you were bored out of your mind. And
Yeah. Um, so yeah, that was a moment for me. Like I really just started enjoying writing this world, and the idea that, so if you don't know anything about Ethereum, it's a cyber mindscape, a little bit like Matrix or Tron. In fact, I mentioned William Gibson, so he's the guy that came up with the whole like Matrix and the whole idea of cyberspace and all that kind of stuff. There's no there and all that. So this was back in the '80s, and he was writing this stuff about this virtual reality, and so that was the world that I was kind of diving into, and the ideas about like what does it look like for me. The initial thought was, what does it look like on the frontier of a virtual reality? Like, what are you looking into? Just zeros and ones like the Matrix, or is it something else? And that kind of stuff. And I was just really having fun with it, just having tons and tons of fun with it, and growing the ideas. And I found myself wanting to come back to it again and again. And then when it came time to start to translate that into game design, I'll freely admit my first efforts at game design were absolutely disastrous. I remember, talk about putting your heart into something. The first, I'd written this rule setup, and I had some ideas about how it was all going to work, and I wanted it to be, the reality to be malleable, because it's in a virtual reality, where people, the game itself takes place in that interior of the virtual world. And I think we got through like one turn, or maybe even half a turn in a half hour. And I looked around the table, and everybody's faces was just like, how do I tell him? How do I tell him this is terrible? And I kind of finished. I said, "This is terrible, isn't it?" And everybody, oh, thank God you said that. So I learned from that, obviously, and we started to really hammer down. And I think like if I had ever had any advice for anybody that had a game in their head, and I think most of us do somewhere, would be to get it on a table as quickly as possible and start trying to play it. Because when it exists in your head, it doesn't. Yeah, I mean that's theory and reality are two very different things, and this is something that. Well, never mind. There was another segue there, but
no, it's so well, because my question, so a lead into that is like, Evan was definitely the expert for us on the game, and what I like to do is Evan brings these games to the podcast, and then I like to not play it until after we talk to you guys, because I like to ask stupid questions that so I'm a new player and a new person, but when I was reading the description, it was kind of like, and Evan earlier before we started recording kind of hit it for me. I was like, this is kind of like Ready Player One meets something, and then he said the TV show reboot, reboot, right? So it's like Ready Player One meets reboot. It's like this weird mix of reality and virtual reality, and inside the this virtual world. So at what point during the process did you ever question how people would connect to that, or were you like, there's enough things like the Matrix or Ready Player One or stuff like that, and I mean the book, not the movie so much, but like that are already out there and people will freely accept this?
For me, it was more just my attachment to Gibson at first, and my kind of affection for his dystopia.
Mm-hmm.
That was the real trigger. I hadn't actually read Ready Player One yet when I first started doing this. I came to that a bit after. I was kind of, I was a little bit concerned that there might not be an audience for it, but on the other hand, I kind of didn't care, and I kind of liked the fact that there wasn't a game out there doing what we're doing. So one of our design principles throughout has been to try and not do something that's totally expected, right? So like to have kind of a new or innovative or purposeful design elements in our game. So in Aetherium, it's that the fact that you can manipulate the reality. You can literally slide these tiles around as you're playing, so that if someone's standing, kind of far away from you, you can spin their room around and pull it towards you, or vice versa. You can, pull an objective or push an enemy away and that type of stuff. And that was when we struck on that mechanic, and it resonated so well with what the world is. I think that at that point, I thought, all right, I'm liking this enough that maybe there's an audience and maybe there's not, but I'm happy with it regardless.
Yeah, and I like that, and I think as creators, right, that's how people have to be like, I'm doing this for the love of it personally, and I think a lot of people, the audience, will follow, right? If you love something and you're putting it out and you have some sort of sense of good dynamic within the game and the art and the thoughts behind it, then the audience will follow, I think.
Yeah, I mean that's the hope for sure. Yeah.
So, Aaron, how was it for you jumping in at Anvil 8 Games and seeing a game like Aetherium with all these mechanics that seem different and kind of nuanced to this game?
It's interesting. I've been playing war games for quite a long time, and I cycle through the games that I play because I like uh, sort of interesting mechanics. I play for the mechanics more than I play for the visuals, more than I play for the world, all that
Mm,
sort of stuff. And Ethereum just does something different in that, every time that I'm designing a game, there's a moment where you're trying to think about what is the best medium for this game. Like, is this actually a board game, or is this a card game? Is this,
mm,
like, there are different ways to sort of physically manifest an idea, and you get different benefits from each. And one of the things that I always think about with war games is, the literal spacing on the table is what makes war games distinct. There aren't um, usually structured spaces in the same way. And so what Ethereum did was it added those spaces back in, but in a way that allowed the table itself to be changed. And that just it really resonated for me, because I was essentially looking at a miniatures game, which is all about where's my model on the tabletop, and this game said, like, yes, and the tabletop is no longer static. So the thing that is compelling, you painted all these pretty miniatures and put them out on the table. And now the table itself is a part of the game in a different way, in a more meaningful way. And so that really meant a lot to me, and sort of drew me over and got me talking to them. And then, it's one of those things that, like, when I talk to people about it, it's something that resonates with a lot of people, because if you play miniatures games, the board doesn't change as you
mm.
play, and yet, there are so many times where you're like, oh, this character's too far from that objective. I guess that they just sit here now. And in Ethereum, no, I will literally rearrange the board. So it was certainly nice there, but it also means that there's a lot of intricacy within those rules, and not that the game is complex, but it also means it essentially means that when you're, like, designing for it or playtesting with it, there are things you have to remember about the game that wouldn't be true in other games. Like,
Mm.
what happens if I make a character a lot faster, means a different thing in Ethereum, because literally the space also moves. So you can make slower characters in a different way and everything like that. It just changes the way you think about it. And frankly, when you've been doing something, the longer you've been doing it, the more you want to think in different ways.
Yeah. So, I guess maybe this is a question for Brian, but Aaron, you can interrupt him. I give you permission on our podcast to interrupt him. At what point did you know that you were going to do miniatures for the game versus tokens or some other, component?
For me, it was pretty important early on to
Okay.
have miniatures involved. And in fact, I still kind of want to build out more like 3D terrain and things like that for the game. I kind of come from that visual aesthetic.
Mhm.
The miniatures games were important to me when I was younger, and um, I just like that. I'm really drawn to that for sure. And so for me, yeah, that was something that I wanted to make happen pretty early on. We've had some feedback early on where someone said like, why doesn't this just be a board game? And it never rang any bells for me somehow.
Mm.
I think it could function as a board game. I just think it's more gripping to have these models, in existing in this world as these representations of these, kind of digital avatars in this world. Um, so yeah, the easy answer is very early on for me that the miniatures were a part of it.
Well, and I would say, I mean, just looking at it, and like some of the research I did, I mean, I think it's kind of the evolution of board games, right? And I think we're seeing a lot of that in the industry today, where it's like, okay, you have board games, we have tabletop war games, like Bolt Action or Legion or something like that,
Mm,
and then you kind of have a game that like yours that more sits in the middle, where it has these these board tiles that you can move around, but then it also has miniatures and it's a skirmish game. And
mhm.
so I think this is kind of that mix that I wonder if it brings in a wider audience to the mix, because it has almost like pieces that anyone could enjoy, I think.
I do, yeah. I think that's the idea. That's the what I feel is one of the appeals. I think we've found that it's easier to bring miniatures gamers towards the board game elements, whereas some of the board gamers are a little bit maybe may not. I don't want to say reluctant, but it takes a little bit more of a sell to get them to see the value. But like you said, I think the industry's changing. If you think of like what a lot of the stuff that Cool Mini's done, I mean, they've got a lot of board games that have these amazing figures that come with them.
Hmm.
And I think so. I think that barrier has crumbled in the last, I would say, 5 to 10 years, certainly.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Yeah, and it almost seems like lately, and this is more geared towards like Kickstarter releases, is that success sometimes seems to hang on the miniatures
Mm,
almost. You
hmm.
know what I mean? Like you
Yeah.
could have a great game, but if you didn't put miniatures in it, people are like, eh. But then if you're like, but it comes with this cool guy, and then everyone's like, yep, click, 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 buy it
Yeah.
all.
That the psychology. I know there's dissertations waiting to be written about, if haven't already, about the psychology of Kickstarter. It is something I would love to figure out a bit more, because to me it's befuddling sometimes.
Yeah. It's interesting. And I think that's one of the things, a lot of times the audience loses, because we're playing games, quote unquote. They don't see it, this other, like the machinery behind making this game possible.
Mm.
And so like a lot of times there's requests or things that they want that they're like, well, just do it.
Yeah,
Like, and
yeah,
it's just not, it's still like a machine that's got these cranks, and and Aaron, I guess you could speak to this, right? Like if there's something like the audience wants, let's say in Ethereum, like they want a new faction or they want a new mechanic. It's not like you can just one day walk into the office and be like, well, I'm putting that in the game.
yeah.
Yeah.
You know.
Yeah, and
So
there's actually a part of game design, and I've talked about this with some fellow designers a number of times, that involves a level of like cognitive dissonance, right? Like, and we can come back to randomization mechanics. I know Brian mentioned them
yeah.
earlier, and at the end of the day, there are probably a lot of people who, I'll just use D&D as an easy example, who would say they want critical failures out of the game. Like that is
Mm.
just miserable, and yet when you actually do it, they don't like it. I mean, obviously some people would, but in a general
Right.
sense, there are times people ask for things they don't really want, and there are times that you have these sort of mechanics that basically they are supporting the overall vision, and that can happen too with production elements. People say that they want X, Y, or Z, but they don't want to pay for it, or they don't want the extra time it takes to produce it, or
Yeah.
I want this insanely detailed miniature, but why is it breaking? You're like, well,
Right.
We
Yeah.
had that experience because when we first released Ethereum, we ran a Kickstarter for it, and at the same time there was another Kickstarter for miniatures, something or another that was going, and they were giving away like 120 miniatures for whatever, like $50 or something like that, and people were saying like, well, why am I not getting 150 miniatures for? And I, like, my response was, yeah, I don't know. Like, I don't know how they're doing that. Like, I don't know how that could possibly happen in like a world that obeys the same kind of rules of physics that mine does.
Yeah.
And sure enough, it never happened.
Well, yeah, and I found too, like the other thing is people and like this is something we try to do on the podcast is educate people about I have a background in product management and marketing, and so I try to educate everyone on the process of, okay, great, I have this idea, but here's all the steps that it requires for me to get it to your door. And I think like one of the big things is people just don't equate money and cost onto anything in the gaming world, from manufacturing all the way through shipping, right? And they're like, well, why can't we get shipping for free on this game? And you're like, because it costs me $18.50 to ship it to you.
Yeah.
And, the game costs me X. If I do this for free, then I make 50 cents, and it's like that doesn't work for us because now I can't pay Aaron.
Right.
Yeah, exactly. And Aaron wants to get paid. I have children.
And like that was one of the things we brought up. We were actually talking in relation to Legion, was that when the tariffs with China were happening, I very specifically was like, you're going to see an increase on Legion miniatures. It was fun, we all had a great time because they were cheaper, but we're going to see an increase on everything just because of the tariffs coming through. And I think sometimes I wonder, and just thinking out loud here, I wonder, going back to like one of my earlier questions, is because even though it's a game and it's an end product, I wonder, because it's still an art form and it's subjective, that people don't tie value to it. There's a philosophical question for you.
Yeah, that's for you, Aaron.
Yeah. I think people attach a lot of value to it. I just don't think that they understand where some of those value elements come from in every case. And so, like when you sell something, so like our MSRP on a product, we don't see most of that. Like that doesn't come to us. And we have all sorts of overhead that you don't account for. And so, you're like, why does this game cost so much? And like from Brian and I's perspective, like when we talk about costs, like we're really going as low as we realistically think we can and still eat at night. And it can seem like something's expensive, and then I get into these moments, and I don't want to sound like bitter or attacking other companies, but I'm like, there are companies that are charging you this and selling 1 million units. And when they sell 1 million units, they are the ones making good money. Like the fact that our prices are comparable to theirs is just a weirdness of the market. Like they are more profitable in like every dimension. And so, like when you talk about, Anvil Games, we're sort of a, I don't know, Brian might not like me saying it, but like a boutique company. We're like this small, like it's just a few of us. We're really passionate, and I think that I think we punch above our weight. But at the end of the day, that doesn't mean that like I have the backing of a multi-million-dollar, crowdfunding platform to get me wherever I want to go.
I know who you're talking about. I'm not a fan, but so what? I think that's too. Like, I think there's this blindness to company size, right? And you're saying, okay, Anvil 8 Games, Aetherium is this beautiful game. Like, I've been looking at the miniatures, they look amazing. The artwork is amazing. The board looks amazing. Like, everything about it looks amazing. The website's super professional, which I can't even tell you how much I appreciate from a consumer level. And so I think you look at that and you're like, these guys are big league. You know what I mean? But really, it's just that you made a bunch of smart choices and smart decisions that got you to a quality product versus, like you said, being a bazillion-dollar company that's just tossing money at stuff because you know your Kickstarter is going to go off for $10 million even if you don't deliver it on time. And so, it's interesting to me, and hopefully, we can help educate people to help, as Aaron put it, boutique developers such as yourself get these games out.
And for the record, I don't object to that description at all.
Okay.
that suits us down to the ground.
Well, now you can't because I doubled down on it.
Yeah,
so.
exactly. I'll be furiously typing an email to Aaron later. Yeah.
So why don't we do this before we close it up? Because I don't believe that we actually we've talked around Aetherium, but we haven't specifically talked about it. So I'll let either one of you take this, but if one of you kind of wants to explain, I'm I'm interested in the world, what's my game experience going to look like?
Yeah, so I'll actually start with the role playing game because there is a role playing game and a miniatures game, and they're set in the same universe. If you're approaching the role playing game, your experience is it's malleable like the world you live in, right? The Aetherium universe is very flexible because it's somewhat created by our collective imagination. So when you play, the gameplay experience we focused on easy basic mechanics, but the ability for players to change almost anything around them, which allows for a lot of creativity. And one of the things that I really value in role playing games is when the mechanics don't really get in my way and I am allowed to be proactive as a player and say, hey, maybe I can do this. And the Aetherium role playing game is set up to allow for that. The mechanics are not complex, there are not a lot of modifiers. They're really there to resolve critical situations and not resolve every little thing you're doing, but you have this other thing, the ability to hack the world around you and change virtually anything. Now, you can do almost anything. Obviously, the difficulty scales, but the important thing is that players have freedom to choose. And I've run this game with a lot of people at conventions, and it has, frankly, to use more of a commerce. It's got great turn rates, right? The number of people who show up and just love the game because they're allowed to be creative. There's not role playing games, if you talk to GMs, there's this thing about getting to yes. And the Ethereum role playing game is at yes all the time. It is this virtual mindscape. Of course you can do that. Let's just see if you survive the attempt. Like it's more on that realm. And so, then players are making the decisions about what they want to do, and the GM's not telling them what they can do as much. Anyway, I mean, obviously there are limitations, but it is a very, very open game that allows players to be creative. And so if you like role-playing games, that's there for you, and it's cyberpunk in style. So there's that too. When you jump over to the war game, the sort of miniatures board game hybrid, I think that you're in for an experience unlike many other games. If you're familiar with war games, it is actually fairly straightforward system. I think sometimes for players, the jargon can make them think it's more complicated than it is, but it's really quite straightforward. It's easy to pick up and play, and it plays fairly quickly. So you can have a lot of fun thinking about what are my possible moves in a situation, as opposed to like the complexity of what this interaction is or something like that. So when you're coming to the war game, you get the chance to experience a war game in a different way, where you can think about problems with creative solutions relating to like moving the tiles around, or how you spend your RAM to get extra CS, essentially like movement points and things like that, because you have the ability to shunt, I'm going to say energy. You have the ability to shunt energy where you need it hopefully when you need it, depending if you've been judicious before that point in time. And so you get to think not only about the game as it's playing out, but you get to think about it on a sort of higher, almost meta level too, which I think is really nice, particularly if you're interested in strategy games and strategy games that don't take 3 or 4 hours to play out.
Okay, so Evan here. Hey, I'm still here. Um, so uh, that said, how do the factions differ? Like, what's their feel for them? Like, I see there's what 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 factions now. Back when I was playing it, there was 4. Like the Axiom, which is the more or less the well, as explained to like the government, right?
Yeah, they're like a fascist police state. Yeah, they believe they've got a boot for every deck,
Oh,
basically.
perfect. That's the pitch you gave to me. Actually, that's why I chose
Yeah.
them. So they were like kind of slower, but they had more infantry and they were tankier. That's kind of how I was looking at it from the outside. But like, how does each like? Can you give me a rough breakdown on each of the factions, like why I might want to play them?
Yeah, absolutely. Aaron, you want me to do this one?
Yeah, yeah.
Okay. So yeah, Axiom is the fascist police state. They're all about control. They like to push people around. They are, yeah, like you said, rather tanky. The Nanime are a kind of a collective of anarchist rioters. They are obviously kind of antithetical to the fascist police state. They are resisting all forms of control, and they see themselves as freedom fighters. But they're so reckless; it's tough to know if there's actually a plan there, if they're just trying to burn it all down. And they are, in a lot of ways, a glass hammer. They've got some, like the Riot Girls, for example, that are really, really punchy, but kind of disappear when you punch them back too hard. And they're pretty chaotic. One of their avatars, the puppeteer, um, is all about that manipulation. He literally cannot stop himself from manipulating the board in some way every turn he activates. So that's the Nanime. House of Karu is one of the major corporations in the world. They are a group of corporate, cyber ninjas, essentially. And they're the kind of Swiss Army knife. They've got a tool for every job. They don't start with a ton of, I guess, action points, like we said, a ton of resources, but they have a nice store that they can kind of throw at any given problem. So when you're playing with the House of Karu, you're definitely thinking about uh, who you want to give most of your resources to each turn, or what specific problem you're trying to solve each turn. And that's kind of where their gameplay is. They can be quite punchy. They can be kind of supportive. They can do all the different things. It's just a question of making sure you've got the right people there at the right time. Then the next faction that came out were the Rezex, and they are the kind of mad scientist adventurer types, the Edmund Hillarys, like people that go out into the frontier, go out into what we call the quantum noise, which is the kind of edge of this kind of like habitable cyberspace. And they're the ones that find new places to build the virtual reality. Um, they are a little bit twitchy from having been out there for so long. They are sometimes a little bit crazy, like I think I said. And their play style is a bit more synergistic. They're trying to create relationships between the different models. The avatars each kind of have an affinity for different parts of the faction, so that they're about kind of getting everything in line for that perfect play. After them, the Romics. The Romics are a what would you call it?
Computer virus.
A virus program that's been injected into the system. The people that did that, I won't give anything away, but that's part of the storyline. People that did that felt that they'd had a kill switch to get rid of this virus program that was weaponized during one of the great trade wars. And it didn't work. Basically, it spun itself out into the void and came back in a new form. So, and obviously they're the monstrous faction. If you like teeth and spikes and creatures and insects and things like that, this is definitely your faction. And they interact with the world in a different way. They're not trying to control the pylons or the control points that generate resources for you. They're more trying to spread their infection wherever they can, their corruption. So their goal is to kind of infest the world more than anything else. Then last year we released the Wardens of Tianran. They are a kind of spiritual faction. They don't see Ethereum as a virtual reality so much as a new plane of existence, or maybe not a new plane, but like a part of our plane of existence, a spiritual plane. And so essentially, they're pretty pissed that people are coming in there and building like shopping malls and things like that, because they see it as an aspect of an enlightened consciousness. And so they've kind of dedicated themselves to the Ethereum itself, and they're on one hand, like I mentioned, kind of monks, but they're warrior monks. They are definitely motivated, and so at least aspects of the faction are definitely motivated about clearing people out. And they are really cool in the way that they interact with the world itself. Their kind of main thing is that the way in which they're connected to the Ethereum is unique.
That's pretty awesome. So I'll go to Aaron first. Favorite faction? You probably have one.
I do. So, sort of thematically, it's the Wardens.
Okay.
Partially because I got to write some of the fluff, so obviously there's like that in there for me.
Oh, sure. Yeah.
And then in gameplay, probably the Rezex. I enjoy that they like to play with the table, and something about synergies, but not like combo win buttons, but just straight synergies makes me feel like I have to try harder to win. And I like when I felt like I tried hard to win, even if I didn't actually try harder. The fact that I felt like I tried harder makes me feel like, oh, you deserve this win, Aaron. And so I appreciate that. I like the Rezex.
Okay. All right, Brian, hit me. Favorite faction?
For me, it's the Nanime, the anarchist rioters. I've loved them from the word go, really. Once, so Rezex was the first faction that I wrote, then Axiom, and then Akaru, and so technically Nanime was the fourth faction I wrote, the second faction to come out, or tied for first, I suppose. But once I started digging into them, I loved the idea that they're this kind of crazy force that doesn't have a center necessarily, and they're like that in gameplay, where they just kind of all over the place, and they're really wild, really unpredictable, which is not like me at all in a lot of ways. So I don't know where that comes from, but I really enjoy the anime for sure.
So
for the models, I have to say the Wardens too are I love painting the Wardens.
Yeah, they're like I didn't like last time I checked in with the game. The virus had just came out, so to see the Wardens, like they kind of surprised me, and I'm like super in, man. I love that warrior monk aesthetic. So like, Corset, here we come for that. But like one last thing. So we talked about both Ethereums. Hit me with Frontline Snow Comrades. Like, what is that?
It is nothing like Ethereum, either version of it. And by design, we deliberately wanted to do something that was kind of off of our our style. But it's a fast action, screw your neighbor card game for 2 to 10 players. And basically, you play as a bunch of conscripts getting marched off to the front by the evil commissar. And every round, something horrible happens. And basically, your job is to stay alive by having those horrible things happen to your comrades instead of you. So Will is the guy that wrote it, and he describes it as a group therapy session. Which and I have to say, the description I just gave you, you have to see the artwork because it is actually very lighthearted. When you describe like, oh yeah, you're getting marched off to the front and you're gonna die, but you want your comrades to die instead of you. That sounds so bad. I actually had this experience with the artist that did it, Kwanchai Maria, who's an absolutely fantastic guy. But I was describing to him, and I was showing him some source imagery from like 1917 and like all this Bolshevik stuff, and he was kind of looking at this, and I was like, yeah, and it's going to be like really fun and like, and he was like looking at me like, you are nuts, but it is. It's definitely meant to be a lighthearted, kind of whimsical almost, but still, strategic game.
And so for listeners, if you go check out their website and look at like for instance, is one of the images is a bear crying running away from a tank. It looks like so.
The
I
tear
mean,
gas,
yeah, that kind of explains it in a nutshell. I think.
I say we have a new expansion for it that just came out called Kameradenschweine. So when we went to Essenspiel, we had a friend of ours and a kind of enthusiast do the translation for us of Frontline No Comrades, and he was kind of saying like, man, it doesn't really work. Like I've translated the words "frontline, no comrades," but it doesn't have the same like sentiment. It doesn't have the same feeling. And he's like, I was thinking about it, and I was thinking about it, and I realized that we already have this word in German, and I was like, oh, I cannot wait to hear what's coming next.
Yeah.
So apparently, Kameradenschweine means friend pig, and
Yep.
it's the name for the name for someone in a group who's trying to help but actually makes things worse. And so when we struck on this, I was like, oh, fantastic. So we actually made an expansion based on this that's just come out. So Frontline No Comrades is a whole new cast of conscripts you can play.
Cool.
Awesome.
I actually own the base game, and I didn't know it actually had the first expansion out, the
Ox
Unux.
the Bears all. Yeah.
Yeah, I didn't know about that one. I picked that up a couple of years ago too. So I'm actually in for some more expansions for it because we actually had a good time with it. It's you're moving back and forth. You're playing cards to kind of manipulate your place so if someone else gets hit. It's actually really fun and really quick, and actually fun, quick games that you can do as like a good warm up for the game night. That's always welcome, especially when you have it plays 10, which is very rare to find a game that can play that many that's fun and quick and not werewolf. For the most part, not werewolf or like any of the spy games or anything like that. So it's a nice change.
Well, cool. I think that's about it, guys. I mean, thank you so much for coming on. It was a real pleasure talking with you guys about this.
Yeah, definitely.
It was great to be here. Thank you very much.
Thanks for having us.
All right, so that was Brian and Aaron from Anvil 8 Games. Their website's anvil-8 spelled out.com. And I highly recommend checking it out and seeing what those games look like. You just heard them conversate and philosophize about their games, and so that was really great.
No, Ethereum's super cool. Like Jay and I were talking before, like Cyberpunk, the game's coming out, right?
Yeah.
And this to me is that, but in a miniature form. And Cyberpunk's great when you want to play. Like, it's gonna be great. I'm gonna play through it and have a great time when it comes out. But when I'm hanging out with my friends and we're all hopped up on Cyberpunk, like Ethereum's like it baby, right? Like
Yeah.
it's literally it for me. So it's like it's been out for a while, and I knew about their pen and paper before I knew Cyberpunk was a thing. Like I didn't know like it was a pen and paper, honestly.
Oh, right.
So they had my attention first, with their world they built. So I'm super in. It's just cool to like get to talk to these guys.
Yeah, and it was interesting, when you brought it up to me as someone you wanted to talk to, I did the research and I was like reading about him, like this is like Ready Player One. Like we're all going to put on our goggles and go into the virtual plane now and do whatever we want. And I think that's super cool. And clearly they're both passionate about it, right? And I think that's always the key with anything is if you can get people who are passionate about it, then you're going to have a great game. So.
And it's funny because one thing I forgot to bring up in the interview, but as character, like you've got your avatar, and then there's some programs that run, which are your miniatures, and then when they die, you get to your better stuff faster, and that represents the load on the server being less because there's not as many programs running, and right, like I'm just so used to that as like a real IT thing. I'm like, oh yes, I can connect with this game mechanic. That makes sense to me. Yes, do turn off more programs. Make the server run good.
God, that's funny. Yeah.
Confused unga bunga noises, but no, man, it's good stuff.
But yeah, okay. So we will we'll catch you guys later. Next week, we will have another game developer on or designer or something exciting. And so join us next week. Same bat channel, same bat place. Everyone have a great week.
Everyone, stay rad.
Join us next week for another edition of the Fifth Trooper podcast.
This has been a Fifth Trooper production.